Hello. Thank you so much, Rachel. It's great to be here in person. Hello to everybody watching online. Do you all remember what it felt like when you discovered this field for the first time? Because I do. So for me, I was living in Arizona. I was 23 years old. And I was actually working at an advertising agency where my job was writing copy for real estate. Within 6 months, I was so bored, and I did not want to ever write about granite countertops again. And so I saw an ad that was posted for a web writer at another agency. And I looked at it and I thought, well, I've worked on a couple websites, and I could probably do that. And mind you, this was the year 2007. And so things were a little bit different then. And so I show up and I get this job. And on my first day of work, I get into this agency and I find out something interesting, which is that I'm not on the creative team with the other writers. And I'm not on like a UX team because we didn't have one. I don't think I even knew what UX was at the time. No, I was actually on the SEO team, which they neglected to tell me. And so pretty soon I found that my job was mostly writing articles that were meant to get search traffic. And I didn't love it, but I got pretty good at it. And after a while, I started getting not just bored, but actually mad, kind of resentful, because I wanted to make something that was meaningful for people, not just for a search engine. And so as I started getting frustrated, what I decided to do this time was a little different. Instead of getting a new job, I started asking questions like, why are we launching these websites with whatever garbage content our clients have given us and then tacking up more garbage after the fact for SEO purposes? And why aren't we thinking about more user-centered content from the start? And maybe most importantly, like, why am I not in any of the meetings where these decisions are happening? And so from that point, what I did is I did everything I could to worm my way into the process. I took over wireframing and a bunch of information architecture because, again, no UX team, so nobody else really wanted to do that work anyway. I started trying to get invited to more meetings, and I pushed and I pushed and I pushed, and eventually I did become a central part of the process. There was only one problem. And the problem was that nobody really knew what my job was anymore. I wasn't a designer, not in the way that this agency thought about design at the time, and I wasn't really a copywriter either. Like, I was spending a lot of time working with developers and collaborating with clients, and nobody knew what to call that or what that was. Until one day, my boss sent me this article. This is a post by Rachel Lovinger from 2008, and so she wrote this post called Content Strategy, the Philosophy of Data. And when I read it, something clicked in me. I saw myself in that article. And maybe even more importantly, I feel like I found myself in that article. Like, up until that moment, I didn't have a professional plan. What I had was an interest in writing and editing and a need to pay the bills while my partner was in graduate school. But once I read that and I was like, oh, this is me. This is what I do. I was hooked. I went all in. And so I followed everyone who was using the content strategy hashtag on Twitter. I read all of the blog posts. I started a local meetup. I may have even like physically fist pumped when I read Christina Halverson's A List Apart article, which was in 2008, where she wrote about like, stop pretending that content is somebody else's problem. Take up the torch for content strategy. Learn it, practice it, promote it. It is time to make content matter. I was like, hell yeah. I took up that torch. I was a content strategist now. And so it felt somehow like noble because I wasn't just writing, I wasn't just marketing, I was doing something meaningful. I was like helping people's experiences online be a little bit better, more inclusive and more usable, more accessible. And I thought, how could anybody not care about this? And so over the next few years, I worked very, very hard to try to convince people to see content the way that I did. Important, valuable, necessary. I advocated, I evangelized, I pitched clients and closed projects, and eventually I left that agency to go solo. And along the way, I started doing a lot of speaking at conferences and consulting and running workshops. And while my career was really solidifying, so was the whole field around me. And I noticed like what used to be seen as all kind of one field turned into all of these related or interrelated fields, right? You've got content design, UX writing, and you've got content architecture and content operations, and you've got all of these different folks who have blossomed into this sort of robust community we have now, or many communities maybe. And so when I look around at what's happening in content now, like 15 years later, when I look at all of the people who are involved in content work today, I think we did it. Like, we're everywhere. And so why aren't we celebrating? Like, why do things feel so gloomy in content land? And that is what I want to talk about today. Because you see, after I spent all of those years consulting and speaking about content, as Rachel was talking about a few years ago in 2020, I shifted everything. I stopped working on products, I stopped working on projects, and I started working directly with people, doing like leadership coaching and training programs for people who are in and around design. And because I know a lot of content people, that's meant a lot of content people have come to my programs. Lots and lots of content leaders, more than 100 of them at this point, from all kinds of organizations, like big organizations, little ones, from tech companies, from startups, from government agencies, etc. Their stories are all a little bit different, but they almost all say the same things, which is that they are struggling. They are feeling overworked and yet undervalued and underleveled and under-resourced. And at their best, people tell me that they feel like they're stretched really thin and they're kind of like forcing a smile while they're being asked to do more with less. At worst, they're burnt out. They don't know why they're there anymore. They're in pain. And so what I want to talk about today is something I think is very important for content leaders in this field that is still emerging, gaining traction, losing traction. It's hard to say sometimes. Is that you don't have to choose between advocating and convincing and fighting for content until you're blue in the face and giving up and kind of falling into that pit of despair. You don't have to carry the weight of this discipline on your personal shoulders all the time. But I think we're going to have to change some things in the way a lot of content leaders have been working in order to make some of that possible. Only today, I'm not going to talk about changing your company, because I think a lot of you have already tried to change your organizations. The decks, the road shows, the people-pleasing, right? All of the work to try to advocate and advocate and advocate. And to be fair, I do think that that work played a role, especially early on, getting people a little bit more interested or a little more aware of content. But I don't think it's working anymore. Because the people I know stuck in that cycle, they are exhausted and they are not getting the power, they're not getting the agency, the respect that they're looking for. They're just busy. So I don't want to talk about changing your organization. What I actually want to talk about is changing the only thing any of us can actually change anyway, which is ourselves. And if you're thinking like ourselves, but like, what about all the layoffs? What about like the reorgs, the return to office mandates? What about the way that CEOs are looking at AI like, that's going to solve all our problems? What about all of that? And I think to that I would say, you're not wrong. Like, all of those things are real. Those things are causing pain. Be mad. But what I also know is that the pain that I hear about collectively in this field, it's actually not new. We've been talking about it for years. We've been talking about the exhaustion. We've been talking about the sort of like endless fight for content. I mean, it's in my own story. You know, I cared so much about content. I identified with it. I saw it as my duty to convince people to care about it as much as I did. It became a huge part of my life, my friendships, my identity. And you know what? There were some serious high points, right? Like I wrote books, I got invited to speak different places. I met this koala after a conference in Sydney. Okay, then I met a cheetah at a conference in South Africa on the same trip. I did not expect this for my life, okay? Like, I did not expect this. This is amazing. But then there were the lows. There were the pointless projects, the slogs, the stuff where I was like, does anybody need this product? And the answer was no. And then there was one particular project that kind of broke me. So the low point for me was when I was in a big meeting and the project sponsor actually cut me off mid-sentence while I was presenting and demanded to know why I was not presenting the deck that we had discussed. Now, I was presenting the deck we had discussed, and I know I was because there was literally one deck. I had no other deck. How do you tell that to your client in a meeting with 25 important stakeholders who are just like looking at you? I still don't know the answer to that question, because what I do know is that I did not do a good job. Because afterward, my colleague, which was somebody I really trusted, somebody I'd considered a mentor, who'd been in that session, she told me it was all my fault, that I was failing at my job. And I was crushed. I was supposed to be a content leader. Like, that was my whole thing. If I wasn't doing that, who was I? And so I've realized that there's a term for a way that a lot of us have approached content work. I think many of you have probably approached your content leadership over the years. It's called vocational awe. It comes from Fobazi Itar, who coined the term in 2017 when she was writing an essay about librarians. And she actually opens the essay with a story from my home city, which is Philadelphia. So in Philadelphia, like many places in the US, there is a terrible opioid and fentanyl crisis. And it is heartbreaking. And so when she was writing this article a few years back, overdoses had started happening at a local public library branch, in and around the library. And so the librarians got together and they decided they needed to intervene. And so what they did is they trained themselves to administer Narcan, the anti-overdose drug. And then they started working on process. Who goes to get help? Who stays with the person who's overdosing? How do we make sure kids get out of the way so they're not present for all of this? Whatever it was, the librarians had a plan for it. People loved this story, loved it. It went viral. They loved the librarians, these like bookish saints jumping up from their desks to go save lives. But librarians aren't saints. Librarians are workers who are often not paid that well and expected to stay late and skip their lunch break. And so what Itar talks about in this article is that while it's a really powerful story about commitment to the community, she says we do librarians a disservice when we talk about the profession as a vocation, not a job, but like a sacred calling. Something librarians are responsible to do, regardless of how hard the work can be, regardless of the pay, regardless of how far their actual job duties have strayed from what they signed up for. She goes on, tasked with the responsibility of sustaining democracy and intellectual freedom, taking a mental health day feels shameful. Awe is easily weaponized against the worker, allowing anyone to deploy a vocational purity test in which the worker can be accused of not being devout or passionate enough to serve without complaint. This is the problem with vocational awe. It teaches us that because our work matters, because it is meaningful in some way, that we have to do whatever it takes to deliver, even if it's harming us, even if it's making us sick, even if it's leaving us sleepless and numb and traumatized. And if we don't, then it means we just don't care enough about the cause. Do you see some parallels? Because I do. I have seen content leaders treat it as their duty to ensure nothing in their organization goes live without their eyes on it, even though it was their company's decision to only have 2 content designers in a 100-person design org. I've seen heads of practices feel so responsible for advocating, convincing, changing hearts and minds that they've burnt out spectacularly. They've made themselves ill. They've needed to take a whole year off to recover. And I've known ones who couldn't take the year off or told themselves they couldn't take the year off. And so what they did is they kept grinding, coping however they could, taking out their stress on their teams, being nasty with their cross-functional partners, burying it all in wine and Netflix at night, and still telling themselves that they're all in, all in. So in 2022, I noticed something else happening though. We were emerging from the worst part of the pandemic, the layoffs were just starting, and I noticed a lot of folks in content who were starting to sort of reject that culture of vocational law, rejecting the idea that the most important thing about them was their job title. And at first I was like, yeah, this is awesome, until I noticed something, which was a lot of people replacing it with nothing but cynicism. I'm only here for the paycheck. I don't care anymore. Why bother? Why bother connecting with my teammate? Why bother turning on video every once in a while to say hi to people? Why bother setting goals? Why bother speaking up? It's just capitalism. And look, I get it. Like, they have a point, especially if you work in tech right now. It is an industry that is full of business models that are extractive and exploitative, of people who are building products that really rely on underpaid and invisible labor, that are surveilling us, that are stealing our creative work. Like, short-term, investor-centered capitalism has a lot to answer for. Be mad. But as much as I want there to be a different world with different kinds of businesses and different kinds of incentives, I'll also tell you, like, the people who are in that cynical place, the none of this matters place, they are not happy. They're adrift. They're marinating in pointlessness, lonely, angry, numb, and often terrible colleagues, corrosive to be around, deeply painful to live in. And I don't want that for any of us. So I want to go back to libraries for a second. I want you to imagine that librarians started to only care about the paycheck. They traded all that vocational law for cynicism. Do we want that world where librarians don't give a shit? Where they're just there to punch a clock? Where they don't derive meaning from things like serving their community or helping create safe places for people to think or dream? Like, I don't think we want that world. Because that work is meaningful. It's necessary. And librarians deserve to feel joy and pride in doing that work. But they also deserve to set limits on that work, and they deserve to be full people outside of that work. Joyful people, curious, happy people. And I want that for all of you, too. Like, you deserve to feel joy and pride in the parts of content work that are meaningful, the opportunities to make, like, everyday tasks a little bit less draining for your users, the efforts to reduce cognitive load and increase accessibility. And you also deserve to feel that meaning, not just in the content work itself, but in the relationships that we have at work. Showing kindness to a struggling peer, or helping a junior teammate grow and thrive, or simply enjoying that little pleasure of, like, solving a thorny problem with other people. But the meaning that I'm talking about here, it's not your job title. It's not your level. It's not your company. It's actually something greater. Because real meaning is a product of living in a way that aligns with your values, that affirms your humanity and our collective humanity. And the thing is that this form of meaning, it doesn't always look grand. It doesn't always look like you are saving the world or curing cancer or stopping climate change. You might not even be stopping your organization from, like, releasing some harebrained product feature. It's the meaning that we find when we are present, when we are generous, and we are kind with each other. And it's the meaning that we find in those thousands of tiny interactions that add up to treating ourselves and the people around us like people with inherent value, people who are worthy of respect. But it's not the job itself, because when we attempt to attach meaning to the job, it's very easy to start attaching our identity to the job too. I did it. We see the job not just as our value in the world, but actually who we are. And honestly, I think this is the biggest risk facing content leaders right now. Not AI, not layoffs, not even the lack of organizational investment in your work, but the fact that I see so many of us wrapping our identities up so tightly in content work, because that over-identification with the job, the belief that content work is like the expression of who you are in the world, it might feel like it gives us purpose, but what I've seen is that it trains us to take things personally. It makes us self-righteous and easily wounded. Like, how dare they disrespect content? How dare they disrespect me? A few months ago, Lyft's head of content design, Alicia Osterello, she wrote about her own experience with some of this and how it broke her mentally and physically. She was sleeping 22 hours a day. She was subsisting on fig Newtons and shame. And finally, she took a leave of absence, and she realized her self-worth was so handcuffed to her title that not actively working felt like a death of self. She describes this insatiable monster who was living inside of her, who sought approval and validation through her work. A monster that wanted the job to love her back. And she was willing to do anything to get that job to love her back. Except the company can't love you. No matter how hard you work, no matter how hard you perform, no matter how much impact you show. But this desire to be loved, to be liked, to be wanted, I see it running very deep in content folks. And sometimes we encourage each other to lean into this mentality, to just do more, to say yes to everything, be helpful, never miss an opportunity to demonstrate your value. Evangelize, evangelize. Did you evangelize enough? The thing is, This is what we're told is going to change hearts and minds. This is what we're told is going to make them want us. But what actually happens is it keeps us stuck in this cycle of seeking validation, looking to be liked or wanted through our work, even when it comes at a high personal cost. And I think we need to break the grip of that external validation. And there's a way to do that. And it's hard work, but it's possible, which is actually about getting in touch with what you think about you. Really understanding, like, what are my strengths and what do I value? What do I like about myself? What do I think good work looks like? The more concrete our sense of self, the stronger our opinions and our taste about the work, the less we have to rely on external validation to tell us how to feel. And then what happens is other people's opinions have a little more distance, and those become information about where that person is, information about what's possible for them right now, what's possible in this environment, in this moment. Not an indictment of our skills and our practice, but just, this is the situation. But this process of like accepting reality, accepting the realities that we work in, it is a lot harder than it sounds. Because humans will go to great lengths to avoid accepting reality. Like we do it every time we pretend a fight in a relationship never happened, or when we tell our friends we're fine when we are not fine, or when we won't look at our email or our credit card statements, or like the mess in our closets. We are so good at avoiding reality, and we do it at work a lot. Like when we run in circles, trying to convince the same VP over and over again, ignoring the signs that this is just not that important to them right now. We do it when we tell ourselves that if we just work late one more night, or on one more weekend, or through one more vacation, we're going to be caught up, and then it's going to be okay. But it's not, because it's a lie. And so the way out of that lie, the way to kind of accept some reality is to really think about radical acceptance. And people are often very uncomfortable with this term, because they think what it means is like you give up and you don't care. That's not what it means. Radical acceptance is about acknowledging what is true right now. And it's about having the courage to be honest with ourselves over and over again about what we're feeling, what we're observing, the world around us. To be honest with ourselves when what we're doing is not working, and then choosing to do something else. I think of radical acceptance as really being around no longer wasting your time and your energy trying to control things that are not in your control, like people's behavior, corporate business models, and then of course beating yourself up when you fail at it. And instead saying, what can I actually do here? And this is why it's freeing, because when you stop spending your time on the things that aren't in your control, new space opens up. You're not like ramming yourself into the same wall over and over again, hoping the wall just disappears. You're reorienting and picking a different path. You can put your energy toward things that you truly can control, like what are the boundaries that you are setting around your work? Like, how are you treating the people that you work with? Like, are you choosing to carry the weight of your company's content decisions on your personal shoulders? So to get to this place of radical acceptance, what I think of is that it's really about gaining distance and becoming an observer. You can imagine your company that's like, and all of its shenanigans are happening on this stage in front of you. But you're high above in that box seat and you're kind of gazing down and you're like, ah, yes, there they are again. Saying one thing and doing another. Ah, yes, there they are. They're playing out their little power struggles. And you have this distance. And it doesn't mean you like it. You don't have to like it. Again, be mad. You just need to see it clearly and be honest with yourself about what you see. And you know, the thing is, this is so much harder than it should be because our brains, they are wired to protect us. They want to keep us safe. They want to avoid harm. And so one of the things that they do is they want to avoid discomfort. It doesn't have to be physical pain, any kind of pain. And so the psychic pain of having to like look at a reality that's unpleasant, they're like, nope, we don't want to do that. And what they do is they make up cognitive distortions to try to avoid it. And I see this all the time with content leaders. There are a few I see constantly. I see a lot of all or nothing thinking, which is a distortion where everything is either winning or losing. Either you're gaining headcount or you're failing. Anytime you start seeing in yourself or the people around you extreme language, words like always or never, anytime we reduce things to good, bad, or all or nothing, we're probably in a cognitive distortion. Or there's mind reading. So much mind reading. Assuming other people's thoughts or beliefs without necessarily having evidence, without asking them. Like, my product manager didn't invite me to the meeting. They don't care about content. They don't respect me. we don't actually know what they think or feel, and they might not be thinking about us at all, which might hurt in a different way, but we don't have to write all those stories in our heads and try to read their minds. There's personalization, which is taking responsibility for things that were actually not yours, like believing you're a failure if your leadership continues to underinvest in content, when the real reason is they're actually not investing in good UX right now because they're prioritizing quick releases that make shareholders happy. It's not about you. There's fortune telling and catastrophizing, which, anybody been on LinkedIn? I have. AI is going to be the death of this field. Nobody should enter the field. You are unethical if you are talking to any junior people about entering content work right now. And okay, don't get me wrong. I do not think you should stick your head in the sand. Like, things are changing, absolutely. But catastrophizing doesn't help us, because what catastrophizing does is actually shut us down. It makes us frozen and hopeless. And so what happens is that we don't actually figure out, what can I do here? How do I evolve? We just go into that realm of that cynicism and that pointlessness. We cannot shape the future if we're stuck in a cognitive distortion, because cognitive distortions are about your panic brain taking the wheel. They're there to get rid of the immediate threat. They're not there to consider the long term. Like, for example, do you know why it's so common for people to blame themselves when something goes wrong? Control. Panic brain. Control. Because, see, if it's all my fault, right? If it's all my fault, I might feel bad. It might not, be pleasant for me. But I can tell myself that if I just work harder, I can prevent that from happening again. But the thing is, working harder is not going to fix the problems in this industry. Because the content leaders I know have worked so hard, and if that was the way to go, it would have fucking happened by now. Excuse me. So I want to change the question. And instead of asking about work, I want to ask, who are you when you're not working? I started asking my clients this a while back, and you know what? The most common answer I got was like, I don't know. I don't know. And I will admit this is still not the easiest question for me to answer, even though I think about it all the time. Because I do care about my work. I care a lot. I spent a lot of time preparing for this talk. I care about showing up for my clients. And honestly, I don't love to admit it, but I care about how I'm perceived. Like, I worry about becoming irrelevant as I age in an industry where youth is valorized and women over 40 are so often rendered invisible. But I do know some things about who I am and things that I like about myself. Like, I'm a thinker and a writer, whether it's monetizable or not. My friend Vanessa once told me that I was the most nuanced person she'd ever met and that I was constantly trying to home in on some detail. I took it as a compliment. I am curious and I like to learn things and I'm hopeful. People don't always see that in me because I often talk about the problems we face in this world, but I don't think of hope as positivity. I think of it as really believing that people can change, that circumstances can change, that healing is possible. I love nature. I love watching kids discover something new. I love having sore muscles because it reminds me I did something. I am so many things when I am not working. And so are all of you. But we have to give ourselves permission to go find them, and maybe even more than that, we have to give ourselves permission to believe that those things are valuable. Not because they give us fresh energy for our work, but just because they give us joy. It's actually what Alicia Osterello from Lyft went in search of on her leave. And she found it in a surfing lesson. She was splashing around in the ocean, feeling vaguely terrified for her life. And she said, I felt boundless joy for the first time in a year and a half. My body remembered something it had long forgotten, how to be in love with existence. And so what I want to ask you today is, what makes you fall in love with existence? And if you don't know, if you have no idea, what would it look like to give yourself permission to find out? And you can call all of this impractical if you want. Like, falling in love with existence is not going to help you land a new role, or increase your salary, or navigate the never-ending politics at work. But I believe that your joy is worth something. And I believe that knowing who you are when you're not working, it's going to make all of those workplace situations feel less like existential crises. It makes it easier to keep things in perspective, to not end up in those cognitive distortions. It makes it a lot easier to look reality in the eye at work and say, okay, this is what is true right now. Now what? It'll help you remember that your life means something, even if your job doesn't always. And so as you listen to all the talks today, as you mingle in the breaks or make friends in the online chat, I hope you hang on to this knowledge, that the meaning we make is so much bigger than a job or a title or an industry. And I hope you start asking yourself some questions, like, who am I? What gives me meaning? What makes me feel alive? What connects me to my values and affirms my humanity? What are the ways that my work can support that? What are the ways my work can give me meaning? And what are the ways that it can't? Where do I need to let go and stop expecting that work to make so much meaning for me? And to stop seeking the validation of my worth through my work? And when I do that, what space opens up? Space to dream or to hope, or maybe space to just be. Thank you.